Hey everybody, how you doing? All right, this is fantasy lesson number 2. In this lesson, we're going to be focused on 2 things. The first thing is going to be focused in on power. So let's think about your series that you are reading thus far. When you've started off reading, who has the power? It could be a person, it could be a thing, it could be an animal, it could be an object. But who has the power? When I'm thinking about The Thief of Always, we've only gone through thus far through the first chapter. In the first chapter, I would say so far the person who has the most power is Rictus. All right? Rictus has the most power because he is the magical dude that came in through the window, and he enticed Harvey with a trip to the holiday house. So on page 9, let me show you the evidence because I'm all about the evidence. On page 9 it says, So you did. Rictus peered out at the rain. I know a place where the days are always sunny, he said, and the nights are full of wonders. Could you take me there? We said no questions, boy. We agreed. Oh yeah, I'm sorry. Being a forgiving sort, I'll forget you spoke, and I'll tell you this. If you want me to inquire on your behalf, I'll see if they have room for another guest. I'd like that. I'm not guaranteeing anything, Rictus said, opening the latch. I understand. So on page 9, that section shows how Rictus seems to have the power. He has the control over whether or not Harvey gets to go to the holiday house. He also has control over whether or not the discussion, right? Harvey does not get to ask any more questions at this point. And I would hope if someone was offering to take you someplace that you've never been, that A, you would ask a lot of questions, and B, that you would not be so desperate and so unhappy and easy to manipulate that you would just want to go with them, right? So it is very apparent that Rictus has the power. It's important to think about power in your story because power and who has it oftentimes is what motivates and moves the plot in the story. Not always, but a lot of times. So I want you to think about first who has the power. All right. We're gonna be looking at chapter 2 and 3 today. And then when we are done listening to chapters 2 and 3, we're going to talk about how the main characters, learn as they go through the story. So since this is the first book in this isn't a series, but let's just say this is the first book. And in a first book in the series, most of the time the author uses a technique. And the technique is that the main character knows very little. And when the main character asks questions, inquires, learns about things, that is a device that tells the reader also what's happening in the story. Okay? So as we are looking at chapter 2 and 3, I want you to pay close attention to when Harvey is asking questions and when he is learning about his new surroundings. Okay? Because that is a device that the author is using so that the author does not have to say, the holiday house is blah, 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 right? Instead, it's intricately woven into the story. So I want you to pay close attention to that. All right?
He said nothing about his peculiar visitor to either his mom or his dad, in case they put locks on the windows to stop Rictus returning to the house. But the trouble with keeping the visit a secret was that after a few days, Harvey began to wonder if he'd imagined the whole thing. Perhaps he'd fallen asleep at the window, he thought, and Rictus had simply been a dream. He kept hoping nevertheless. Watch for me, Rictus had said, and Harvey did just that. He watched from the window of his room. He watched from his desk at school. He even watched with one eye when he was lying on his pillow at night. But Rictus didn't show. And then, about a week after that first visit, just as Harvey's hope was waning, his watchfulness was rewarded. On his way to school one foggy morning, he heard a voice above his head, and looked up to see Rictus floating down from the clouds, His coat swelled up around him so that he looked fatter than a prize pig. "How you doin'?" he said as he descended. "I was starting to think I'd invented you," Harvey replied. "You know, like a dream." "I get that a lot," Rictus said, his smile wider than ever. "Particularly from the ladies. You're a dream come true, they say," he winked. "And who am I to argue? You like my shoes?" Harvey looked down at Rictus's bright blue shoes. They were quite a sight, and he said so. "I got given 'em by my boss," Rictus said. "He's very happy you're going to come visit, so are you ready?" "Well—" "It's no use wasting time," Rictus said. "There may not be room for you tomorrow." "Can I just ask one question?" "I thought we agreed." "I know, but just one." "All right, one." "Is this place far from here?" "Nah, it's just across town." "So, I'd only be missing a couple of hours of school?" "That's two questions," Rictus said. "No, I'm just thinking out loud." Rictus grunted. "Look," he said, "I'm not here to do a great song and dance persuading you. I got a friend called Jive, does that. I'm just a smiler. I smile and I say, 'Come with me to the holiday house.' And if folks don't want to come," he shrugged, "hey, it's their hard luck." With that, he turned his back on Harvey. "Wait," Harvey protested. "I want to come, but just for a little while." "You can stay as long as you like," Rictus said. "Or as little. All I want to do is take that glum expression off your face and put one of these up there." His grin grew even larger. "Is there any crime in that?" "No," said Harvey. "That's no crime. I'm glad you found me. I really am." So what if he missed all of the morning at school, he thought. It'd be no great loss. Maybe an hour or two of the afternoon as well. As long as he was back home by 3 or 4. Certainly before dark. "I'm ready to go," he said to Rictus. "Lead the way." Millsap, the town in which Harvey had lived all his life, wasn't very big, and he thought he'd seen just about all of it over the years. But the streets he knew were soon behind them, and though Rictus was setting a fair speed, Harvey made sure he kept a mental list of landmarks along the way, in case he had to find his way home on his own. A butcher's shop with 2 pigs' heads hanging from hooks. A church with a yard full of old tombs beside it. The statue of some dead general covered from hat to stirrups in pigeon dung. All these sights and more he noted and filed away. And while they walked, Rictus kept up a stream of idle chatter. "I hate the fog, just hate it," he said. "And there'll be rain by noon. We'll be out of it, of course." He went on from talk of rain to the state of the streets. "Look at this trash all over the sidewalk. It's shameful. And the mud, it's making a fine old mess of my shoes." He had plenty more to say, but none of it was very enlightening. So after a while, Harvey gave up listening. How far was this holiday house? He began to wonder. The fog was chilling him, and his legs were aching. If they didn't get there soon, he was going to turn back. "I know what you're thinking," said Rictus. "I bet you don't." "You're thinking this is all a trick. You're thinking Rictus is leading you on a mystery tour, and there's nothing at the end of it. Isn't that true?" "Maybe a little." "Well, my boy, I've got news for you. Look up ahead." He pointed, and there, not very far from where they stood, was a high wall, which was so long that it disappeared into the fog to right and left. "What do you see?" Rictus asked him. "A wall," Harvey replied, though the more he stared at it, the less certain of this he was. The stones, which had seemed solid enough at first sight, now looked to be shifting and wavering, as though they'd been chiseled from the fog itself, and piled up here to keep out prying eyes. "It looks like a wall," Harvey said, "but it's not a wall." "You're very observant," Rictus replied admiringly. "Most people just see a dead end, so they turn around and take another street. But not us. No, not us. We're going to keep on walking. You know why? Because the holiday house is on the other side? What a miraculous kid you are, Rictus replied. That's exactly right. Are you hungry, by the way? Starving. Well, there's a woman waiting for you in the house called Mrs. Griffin. And let me tell you, she is the greatest cook in all of America land. I swear on my tailor's grave. Anything you can dream of eating, she can cook. All you have to do is ask. Her deviled eggs. He smacked his lips. Perfection. I don't see a gate, Harvey said. That's because there isn't one. So, how do we get in? Just keep walking. Half out of hunger, half out of curiosity, Harvey did as Rictus had instructed. And as he came within 3 steps of the wall, a gust of balmy, flower-scented wind slipped between the shimmering stones and kissed his cheek. Its warmth was welcome after his long, cold trek, and he picked up his pace, reaching out to touch the wall as he approached it. The misty stones seemed to reach for him in their turn, wrapping their soft, gray arms around his shoulders and ushering him through the wall. He looked back, but the street he'd stepped out of, with its gray sidewalks and gray clouds, had already disappeared. Beneath his feet the grass was high and full of flowers. Above his head the sky was midsummer blue, and ahead of him, set at the summit of a great slope, was a house that had surely been first imagined in a dream. He didn't wait to see if Rictus was coming after him, nor to wonder how the gray beast February had been slain and this warm day risen in its place. He simply let out a laugh that Rictus would have been proud of, and hurried up the slope and into the shadow of the dream house. Chapter 3. Pleasure and the Worm. What a fine thing it would be, Harvey thought, to build a place like this. To drive its foundations deep into the earth, to lay its floors and hoist its walls, to say, where there was nothing, I raised a house. That would be a very fine thing. It wasn't a puffed-up peacock of a place either. There were no marble steps, no fluted columns. It was a proud house, certainly, but there was nothing wrong with that. It had much to be proud of. It stood 4 stories high and boasted more windows than Harvey could readily count. Its porch was wide, as were the steps that led up to its carved front door. Its slated roofs were steep and crowned with magnificent chimneys and lightning rods. Its highest point, however, was neither a chimney nor a lightning rod, but a large and elaborately wrought weather vane, which Harvey was peering up at when he heard the front door open and a voice say, Harvey Swick, as I live and breathe. He looked down, the weather vane's white silhouette still behind his eyes, and there on the porch stood a woman who made his grandmother, the oldest person he knew, look young. She had a face like a rolled-up ball of cobwebs, from which her hair, which could also have been spider's work, fell in wispy abundance. Her eyes were tiny, her mouth tight, her hands gnarled. Her voice, however, was melodious and its words welcoming. I thought maybe you'd decided not to come, she said, picking up a basket of freshly cut flowers she'd left on the step. Which would have been a pity. Come on in. There's food on the table. You must be famished. I can't stay long, Harvey said. You must do whatever you wish, came the reply. I'm Mrs. Griffin, by the way. Yes, Rictus mentioned you. I hope he didn't bend your ear too much. He loves the sound of his own voice. That and his reflection. Harvey had climbed the porch steps by now and stopped in front of the open door. This was a moment of decision, he knew, though he wasn't quite certain why. Step inside, Mrs. Griffin said, brushing a spider hair back from her furrowed brow. But Harvey still hesitated, and he might have turned around and never stepped inside the house, except that he heard a boy's voice yelling. I got ya, I got ya, followed by uproarious laughter. Wendell, Mrs. Griffin said, are you chasing the cats again? The sound of laughter grew even louder, and it was so full of good humor that Harvey stepped over the threshold and into the house, just so that he could see the face of its owner. He only got a brief look. A goofy, bespectacled face appeared for a moment at the other end of the hallway. Then a piebald cat dashed between the boy's legs, and he was off after it, yelling and laughing again. He's such a crazy boy, Mrs. Griffin said. But all the cats love him. The house was more wonderful inside than out. Even on the short journey to the kitchen, Harvey glimpsed enough to know that this was a place built for games, chases, and adventures. It was a maze in which no two doors were alike. It was a treasure house where some notorious pirate had hidden his blood-stained booty. It was a resting place for carpets flown by djinns and boxes sealed before the flood, where the eggs of beasts that the earth had lost were wrapped and waiting for the sun's heat to hatch them. It's perfect, Harvey murmured to himself. Mrs. Griffin caught his words. Nothing's perfect, she replied. Why not? Because time passes, she went on, staring down at the flowers she'd cut. And the beetle and the worm find their way into everything sooner or later. Hearing this, Harvey wondered what grief it was Mrs. Griffin had known or seen to make her so mournful. I'm sorry, she said, covering her melancholy with a tiny smile. You didn't come here to listen to my dirges. You came to enjoy yourself, didn't you? I guess I did, Harvey said. So, let me tempt you with some treats. Harvey sat himself down at the kitchen table, and within 60 seconds, Mrs. Griffin had set a dozen plates of food in front of him. Hamburgers, hot dogs, and fried chicken, mounds of buttered potatoes, apple, cherry, and mud pies, ice cream and whipped cream, tangerines, and a plate of fruits he couldn't even name. He set to eating with gusto, and was devouring his second slice of pie, when a freckled girl with long, frizzy blonde hair and huge blue-green eyes ambled in. You must be Harvey, she said. How did you know? Wendell told me. How did he know? She shrugged. He just heard. I'm Lulu, by the way. Did you just arrive? No, I've been here for ages, longer than Wendell, but not as long as Mrs. Griffin. Nobody's been here as long as she has, isn't that right? Almost, said Mrs. Griffin, a little mysteriously. Do you want something to eat, sweetie? Lulu shook her head. No, thanks. I haven't got much of an appetite at the moment. She nevertheless sat down opposite Harvey, stuck her thumb in the mud pie, and licked it clean. Who invited you here? She asked. A guy called Rictus. Oh, yeah. The one with the grin? That's him. He's got a sister and 2 brothers, she went on. You've met them, then? Not all of them, Lulu admitted. They keep themselves to themselves. But you'll meet 1 or 2 of them sooner or later. I don't think I'll be staying, Harvey said. I mean, my mom and dad don't even know I'm here. Sure they do, Lulu replied. They just didn't tell you about it. This confused Harvey, and he said so. Call your mom and dad, Lulu suggested. Ask them. Can I do that? He wondered. Of course you can, Mrs. Griffin replied. The phone's in the hallway. Carrying a spoonful of ice cream with him, Harvey went to the phone and dialed. At first there was a whining sound on the line, as though a wind were in the wires. Then, as it cleared, he heard his mom say, Who is this? Before you start yelling, he began. Oh, honey, his mom cooed. Did you arrive? Arrive? You are at the holiday house, I hope? Yes, I am, but... Oh, good. I was worried maybe you'd lost your way. Do you like it there? You knew I was coming? Harvey said, catching Lulu's eye. I told you, she mouthed. Of course we knew, his mom went on. We invited Mr. Rictus to show you the place. You looked so sad, you poor lamb. We thought you needed a little fun." "Really?" said Harvey, astonished by this turn of events. "We just want you to enjoy yourself," his mom went on. "So you stay just as long as you want." "What about school?" he said. "You deserve a little time off," came the reply. "Don't you worry about anything. Just have a good time." "I will, Mom. Bye, honey. Bye." Harvey came away from the conversation shaking his head in amazement. "You were right," he said to Lulu. "They arranged everything." "So now you don't have to feel guilty," said Lulu. "Well, I guess I'll see you around later, huh?" And with that she ambled away. "If you're finished eating," Mrs. Griffin said, "I'll show you to your room." "I'd like that." She duly led Harvey up the stairs. At the landing, basking on the sun-drenched windowsill, was a cat with fur the color of the cloudless sky. "That's Blue Cat," Mrs. Griffin said. "You saw Stew Cat playing with Wendell. I don't know where Clue Cat is, but he'll find you. He likes new guests." "Do you have a lot of people coming here?" "Only children. Very special children like you and Lulu and Wendell. Mr. Hood won't have just anybody." "Who's Mr. Hood?" "The man who built the holiday house," Mrs. Griffin replied. "Will I meet him too?" Mrs. Griffin looked discomfited by the question. "Maybe," she said, her gaze averted. "But he's a very private man." They were up on the landing by now, and Mrs. Griffin led Harvey past a row of painted portraits to a room at the back of the house. It overlooked an orchard, and the warm air carried the smell of ripe apples into the room. "You look tired, my sweet," Mrs. Griffin said. "Maybe you should lie down for a little while." Harvey usually hated to sleep in the afternoon. It reminded him too much of having the flu or the measles. But the pillow looked very cool and comfortable, and when Mrs. Griffin had taken her leave, he decided to lie down, just for a few minutes. Either he was more tired than he'd thought, or the calm and comfort of the house rocked him into a slumber. Whichever, his eyes closed almost as soon as he put his head on the pillow, and they did not open again until morning.
Okay, so that was chapter 2 and 3. I would like to really focus on chapter 3 today. So in chapter 3, there on page 20, they talk a lot about the setting. I'm going to continue focusing on the setting because the setting oftentimes in fantasy is really critical to understanding the story. So let's take a look on page 20. It wasn't a puffed up peacock of a place either. There were no marble steps, no fluted columns. It was a proud house, certainly, but there was nothing wrong with that. It had much to be proud of. It stood 4 stories high, and it boasted more windows than Harvey could readily count. Its porch was wide, as were the steps that led up to its carved front door. Its slated roofs were steep and crowned with magnificent chimneys and lightning rods. So from this description, I can determine that this house in which Harvey has arrived at is not necessarily fancy. They describe it doesn't have marble, it doesn't have fluted columns, all of which might make it fancy. But the way they describe it, it sounds to be nice. It's 4 stories high. It has a large porch. The door is nicely carved. And so this is starting to give me a visual image of the holiday house. This is important because the setting in this story and many fantasy stories is going to be a main character in this story along with Harvey. We don't know it yet, but we need to pay attention to it because we will come back to this. Also, we are introduced to a lot of the characters in the story. We want to pay particular attention to their descriptions so that we have a better idea and a visual of who they are. On page 21, we have a description of Mrs. Griffin. They describe her as, she had a face like a rolled up ball of cobwebs, from which her hair, which could also have been spider's work, fell in wispy abundance. Her eyes were tiny, her mouth tight, and her hands gnarled. Her voice, however, was melodious, and its words welcoming. So from that description, I can determine that Mrs. Griffin must be pretty old. When someone is described as having cobwebs on their face, that's not necessarily flattering. And her hair, they describe it as falling in wispy abundance, so that means it's like light and airy, and her eyes are tiny and her mouth tight, like that. Her hands gnarled, which means they're like beaten up, kind of ugly and bent and crooked, maybe dirty. Her voice, though, was melodious, which means it's a nice sound to the ear. Okay? So that's starting to give me a little bit of indication about Mrs. Griffin. We also meet Wendell. Wendell, our first impressions are on page 21. It says, I gotcha, followed by uproarious laughter. Wendell, Miss Griffin says, are you chasing the cats again? The sound of laughter grew even louder, and it was so full of good humor that Harvey stepped over the threshold and into the house, just so that he could see the face of its owner. He only got a brief look. A goofy, bespectacled face appeared for a moment at the other end of the hallway. So we're going to learn that that is Wendell. And from that description, I can determine that Wendell seems like a happy-go-lucky kind of kid. He likes cats, he likes laughter, he likes to have fun. They describe him as goofy and bespectacled, which means he has glasses. And so these details are important because I'm starting to learn about the other characters in the story. All right, so we're really paying attention to the setting, we're paying attention to who has power, and third, we're learning along with the main character. So when the main character asks questions, we want to pay particular attention to this because this is a device that oftentimes the author uses so that we as the reader get information along with the main character. It makes it a little bit more interesting. Instead of having pages and pages of description, the dialogue and the questions in particular help move this information along. So on page 22 it states, "It's perfect," Harvey murmured to himself. Mrs. Griffin caught his words. "Nothing's perfect," she replied. "Why not?" "Because time passes," she went on, staring down at the flowers she'd cut, "and the beetle and the worm find their way into everything sooner or later." So this has a lot of figurative language, and so it might be a little bit harder to determine the meaning. But first off, I noticed that when Harvey describes the house, he's describing the house as perfect, and Miss Griffin says, "Oh, nothing's perfect," which I find a bit odd. Like when people come over and they say, "Oh, I like your home, it's very nice," most people just are gracious. They say thank you. Oftentimes they're very humble about it. But instead, Miss Griffin says nothing's perfect, which is like, that stood out to me. And then she talks about how time passes and eventually the beetle and the worm find their way into everything sooner or later, which is a metaphor for death, essentially, because those are two decomposers. You might not pick up on, but there's a question there. He's asking, why not? And that question is important because it gives us some information. It will foreshadow, some things coming later. On page 25, we get another very important question. Harvey asks, "Do you have a lot of people coming here?" "Only children. Very special children like you and Lulu and Wendell," Mr. Hood wouldn't have just anybody. Who's Mr. Hood? The man who built the holiday house, Mrs. Griffin replied. Will I meet him too? Miss Griffin looked down, discomforted by the question. Maybe, she said, her gaze averted, but he's a private man. So from here, I start to determine a little bit about Miss Griffin. She seems a little bit dodgy in the way that she's answering this. She's not being direct. I also notice that we learn about Mr. Hood, which I haven't learned about him yet. Apparently he owns the holiday house, but and lots of kids come here. So this is giving me indication about why Wendell, why Lulu, and it's starting to give me a bit of a window into what's happening here. So, as I stated, I want you to pay particular attention to when the main character is asking questions, because you should be paying attention and learning along with the main character. Now, as you are paying attention to this, you need to come up with a way that works for you, that you can capture your ideas. I've been taking notes. You can't see that, but I have. Since I bought this book again, I am writing notes in the margins when I notice a part that stands out to me that I want to discuss. So when we have our book club meetings, I expect you come with some specific evidence from the book. And I want you to be paying attention to 3 things that we're going to talk about. I want you to pay attention to the setting, when, where, and what is it like to be in the character's head in that setting, so the psychological impacts of the setting. Number 2, I want you to pay attention to who has the power. Who has the power in the story, and why do they have the power, and how do you know? All right, power is pretty important. It moves along the plot, so pay attention to that. And third thing, I want you to pay attention to when the character is asking questions, because oftentimes those answers are very important for our understanding of the story. All right? I look forward to discussing your specific books with you in book clubs. Have a lovely day, and I will talk to you soon. Bye-bye.